A few weeks ago, I shared a video all about painting ink, watercolour and gold leaf on canvas. And I had so much fun that I've done another one, and here's my super shiny hare. This was my greyhound that I did, and if you haven't seen that, the link will be in the description. And here's my hare. I made sure they were running the opposite direction because if they are seen together, I don't want it to look like the hound is chasing the hare, because hare coursing is disgusting. So please join me and I'll show you how I start with an ink underpainting, then I use watercolour, and then I use gold leaf to create this very shiny background. And if you want to find out more about painting watercolours on canvas, I do have a full course at www.lizchadertonstudio.co.uk, and that starts from preparing the canvas, painting in pure watercolour, introducing ink, all sorts. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I share tips and tricks I wish I'd known about ages ago. I love watercolour on paper, don't get me wrong, but I also like to experiment and see how far I can push my beloved watercolour, and I love to use it on canvas. So here are my two super shiny animals. I'm just waiting for frames to turn up so I can just finish them off and get them on the wall. I've prepared a 30 by 60 centimetre canvas, and 30 by 60 is 12 by 24 inches, with 3 thin coats of watercolour ground to make it slightly more absorbent, because if you try to use Indian ink, which is what I plan to do, watercolour on ordinary canvas, it's repelled by it and there's no absorbency. So the watercolour ground will just make it a little bit easier to work on. And my plan for this running hare is to use, say, Indian ink as an underpainting. So it's just going to be a monochrome underpainting. Then lots of lovely colours, not sure which yet, we'll get there. And the third layer is going to be gold leaf all around the background. Indian ink on watercolour canvas is not 100% waterproof, and we can use this to our advantage. So I'm starting with the eye, and I'm using this pigment liner or fine liner, which usually would be waterproof on paper, but here I can add a little bit of water and move the line around and therefore use it in a really painterly way. So I start with the pen and do some details of the features, particularly the eye and the nose, and then I'm going to move on to stronger washes of pure Indian ink, which I'll put on with the brush. You do need to move relatively fast, because the more the pen dries on the surface, the more waterproof it becomes. But here you can see me working on the eye. I'll have to leave certain areas to make sure they don't all smush into each other, but I'm really trying to add lots of water and let the ink do lots of work for me. Here I've moved on to the ink rather than the pen, and again I'm using water, and I love the way the ink just travels through the water. You can get hard and soft edges, you can get really bold darks, or you can get every shade of grey up to, well, dirty water, I guess. Now I'm working on the ears, and I will need to be careful to make sure that the ears don't merge into each other. So just as you would on paper with watercolour, leave little gaps of dry, and that will stop everything merging in. But I love the way the ink travels through the water. Look at it move all by itself. I try to join all the different areas together so that the features and the different bits of the anatomy aren't separate. So thinking of big shapes and moving through the hair. I am using quite a small brush at the moment, and I will move to a larger one. I think it just felt quite safe using this size brush. Because I do need to leave some of these dry areas and come back to different bits of the hair, I think what I'll do is a general overall painting of the hair, maybe 85% of the ink that I want to do, let it dry and then come back in with details So it might look a bit clunky at this point, but we can refine it as we go along and add the implication of details rather than adding every hair or every muscle of its body. We're trying to leave a little ambiguity so that there's lots for the viewer to fill in the gaps and to enjoy looking at that image and seeing something new every time. I'm trying to concentrate on shapes and on that real tonal range from those very dark areas through to the lightest lights. When you're working with Indian ink, it's on canvas, it's far more forgiving than you think. So if you need to lift it off, you can just use a kitchen towel to lighten areas. While it's wet, you can just drop extra in and it'll feather through the wet areas. So I think it's great fun. You can use a little spray bottle to move the water around on the surface if you like. You can spatter in concentrated drops of ink to get a little starburst. You can do all the sorts of things that you might do with watercolour, and it's very reactive. Here on its belly you can see some lovely feathery marks as the ink is travelling through the watercolour. I drew the hair with a watercolour pencil and you can see that just disappearing into the washes, so it's not there. If you do need to refine your drawing, of course you can just use the ink pen to get any edges or to remind you of things that you want to leave. I'm now using that little spray bottle and look at the ink just move on the surface. Try not to use a hairdryer to dry your work because it sits so on the surface it will just blow around and you would end up losing these lovely little flows. What you can do is sprinkle in salt to your wet ink and that will create really fascinating textures. Leave it in place to dry naturally if you want to maximise that effect. And here I'm spattering in a little more ink just to really create the illusion of texture in its fur. The initial layer of ink has dried and I've just wiped off all that salt because we don't want that left on there. Look at the amazing marks it's given us. Now this is all a bit rough and clunky, so what I need to do is grab both my Indian ink and my pens and go back in and refine everything. Using this picture just to get a close-up of the eye. I can't remember if I said earlier that the canvas is quite rough on your pens and on your equipment. Just go careful and don't use anything overly precious. I won't put the whiskers in at the moment because of course this is going to be gold round here, so if I put any whiskers in they would all just disappear. If you have any marks that you're not happy with, one of the great things about watercolour on canvas, or sorry, ink on canvas, is you can still amend and erase it. And you'll think, how is she doing that? I'm using a tiny bit of magic eraser, which is a melamine sponge, and once it is damp, not sopping wet, just damp, you can rub it over and it will lift quite a lot of your ink. And we always think of ink as waterproof, as you know, once it's down, tough. But the great thing is on canvas it's not fully waterproof and you can still amend should you wish to. Let's get a better shape here. Again, we can blend. That's a bit better. So this is a rollerball pen. It's a uniball pen. It's still got lovely waterproof pigment ink in it, but seems to be a bit happier on the canvas. Just want to imply detail without getting utterly caught up in it. I'll put in a claw. Now don't worry about this here if it's a mess and you don't want it like that, because of course we can do a little bit of sculpting when we put the background in. Now often I don't need to put 2 layers of ink on. I do pretty much all the work in the first layer. I don't quite know why I do need so much in this second layer, but it's not a problem. Let's sort out that lovely floofy tail. Definition. So I'm going to grab a little bit of ink on my brush and just get some nice starry marks onto its haunches. Okay, let's have a look at our hair, and I think that's probably enough at the moment. I'll let that dry off. I can rest my eyes. There's something wrong around this nose. I'm going to sort that out. And then we can go for the next part of it. As the hair is drying, let's think about colours. And I've got burnt sienna, bit of purple, bit of grey, and I don't honestly know what that colour is. It's an old palette that I had some leftover colours in that I thought, I can use those. So I've just added a bit of water to activate them. Oh, that's phthalo blue. And when I'm painting on canvas, I like to add a couple of drops of Aquafix into my washes. Now, Aquafix, if you've not heard of it, actually makes your watercolours waterproof, which is a bizarre thing, isn't it? But because our canvas is not particularly grippy, by adding just a few drops, I don't want to make my watercolours waterproof, I just want to make them more water resistant. So I'm adding about 3 drops to these small washes. You do need to be careful because you wouldn't add this to your pans of watercolour if you were using a tin, because it would seal the watercolour. You won't be able to reactivate your colours once they're dry because this has waterproofed them. So you do need to use it with a certain amount of caution. And you can see it looks a little milky in the palette. All you do is mix it in and you're good to go. I'm going to start with that eye and then work out from the eye, putting in very loose washes of colour and letting them mix on the surface, because of course what we've got is all that lovely ink work that's going to do loads of the hard work for us. And don't really have to work terribly hard at this layer. So I'm letting those colours mix on the surface. That phthalo blue is always nice in the white areas. If you've chosen pretty transparent colours, they will just float beautifully over the top of the ink. I am using a very small brush, and of course if I used a larger one, something more akin to that, it would stop me fiddling. Now I was a bit sloppy with that mark. Actually, it doesn't matter because of course we've got gold leaf coming on here. Of course, you can use whatever colours you want because we do not have to be accurate with the colours in our work if we don't want to. If we want to choose colours that we think expresses the emotion more, well, then we can do that. Again, I'm stroking the animal and the way its muscles and fur are, just to get really natural movement in my marks. Splattering in a few dots to create more texture on its fur. Just going to drop in a tiny bit of purple into some of the dark areas. Purple and burnt sienna does make a lovely brown. So when you're happy with the depth of colour and the variation you've got, of course you need to stop. Our hare is totally dried. In fact, he dried overnight. And this is what he looks like after the first two stages. So the ink underdrawing and then the watercolour on top. And the next stage is to apply gold leaf. Apply gold leaf, whether it's imitation or real, we need to use size. It's just the name of the glue we use. And what's special about this is that it never fully dries. That's going to be too much, sorry. It dries to be sort of slightly tacky, and that's just enough to grip the gold leaf without damaging it. I like this Polyvine gold size simply because it dries in 15 minutes if you put a thin layer on, and patience is not my strong suit. And what I like to do is to tint it with watercolour. I choose a colour that tones with the picture or gives me the sort of temperature that I'm after, because not only does tinting your gold size help you see where you've applied it, as your gold is put on, it slightly breaks up, almost cracks sometimes, and the background colour can shine through very subtly. So if you put black underneath gold, it looks really cool. They used to do that in the Art Deco period. If you put traditional red bole, which is, well, a darker red, like a red iron oxide, it makes it super warm. I quite like blue under it sometimes because it gives it that sort of coppery verdigris colour. I am using an old brush, not one of my posh watercolour brushes, because the gold size would not be good for that. And I've just tinted it. We start applying the gold size to anywhere that we want the gold leaf to stick. So I'm going under the hare's belly, but when I get to here, I just want to be careful because I'm actually going to cover up some of this because that shape is not quite right. You can use it almost to sculpt the subject. But I might not want a super smooth outline. So say here on its chest, I want that to be a little bit more broken. So I've made sure that edge isn't too perfect. The other thing we can do is just load our brush and then tap it gently, and we will get some tiny little dots of gold size into the subject, and we can stick some gold there, and that will bring the outside into the subject. I'll move to a bigger brush in a moment, but let's carry on with my outlining. Now around this tail, definitely want a floofy edge, So I'm coming away from the colour because that hare's tail is white, and I'm breaking up that edge like that. Now at this point it's going to look pretty unattractive. Just don't let anyone see what you're doing until it's finished. The gold is transformational. I've decided I'm going to add the whiskers on over the top of the gold leaf. I was thinking about whether I would leave gaps with the whiskers, but I'm going to put them in ink over the top. Okay, what do we think to that? Having done the edges of our hair, I can get a larger brush and put the gold size everywhere else. And let's not forget the edges as well. You want to apply enough that it goes into the weave of the canvas. You wouldn't want it to break up like that because your gold leaf will only stick where you've put your gold size. A thin layer like this will take 15 minutes to dry. You can use a hairdryer as well, should you be very impatient. Thicker bits like those little dots we flicked in may take an hour, even longer, just depending on the size. Now let me show you what you can do. So I'm loading my brush and then I am just putting in a few little dots. I think it just breaks up the background and gives almost a little movement to it. These big dots will take a long time to dry, and it's really worth being patient so that you get a nice dome, whereas if you do them too soon you'll end up with a crater. I think the gold size is about dry. Listen to this. You should just get a sort of slight tackiness, bit like a post-it note. That's what we're looking for. And here I have my gold leaf. This is loose leaf, so it's just sandwiched between little bits of tissue paper. You can get stuff that's called transfer gold leaf, which is actually sort of stuck to the backing paper. Far easier to handle, more expensive, and it's no good if you're trying to get into deep texture. Don't worry if your gold leaf is a little chewed around the edges like this, because we can use that very, very easily. So if you get a piece of the gold leaf on paper, so move it to the edge and then draw it across like this, and I'm removing the paper. It should go on pretty smoothly, and I'm just going to gently tap it in place to stick it. So I've got it on a single piece of paper. I'm going to overlap it by just a couple of millimeters with the previous bit. I'm just going to also bend it round the edge. This one I couldn't because it was a shorter one, so we'll come back and patch that bit up, but that is there. And we just need to do that all over our picture. Now this is not the super traditional way of gold leafing. In that case you would have a gilder's tip, which is like a special brush for picking it up. But we're trying to do this in a practical and easy way. Real gold leaf is probably at least 10 times as expensive as artificial. Now I scrunched it up there. I am not going to panic. We need to tap it down. Sometimes it's quite nice just to put the tissue down, and then we can use that just to fix it in place, and that stops oils from your fingers or dirt from your fingers getting onto the gold leaf. You can see that I'm overlapping the image, No glue here. The leaf will not stick, so that's fine. If you need to cut a sheet, I like to just keep it sandwiched between two of those tissue paper pieces, and then say you can cut a piece. These are not very sharp scissors, but you get the idea, because otherwise you'll find the scissors scrunch the leaf up. But here I can now place that there, round the edge, fill that in. So I'm going to start touching up the edge with small pieces. Okay, once it's totally covered, grab a soft, clean brush and then gently tamp it down. Can you see that's where one of the dots was? So I'm just going to gently push it into place so that dot really shows up nicely. Now don't panic if you've got a little gap like that. In gilding, that is called a holiday, which I think is rather lovely. Any excess that you take off from overlaps, like these little bits, they are called skewings, and you can use the skewings just to fill in your holidays. Either press it down with your fingers. I mean, if you're being particular, it would be better not to touch it with your hands too much. But as you may have guessed, I'm not a particular person. So excess you can just gently take off and then use elsewhere. Oh, that's its tail. Is that the... Yes, look, that's, I've got it upside down. Didn't even know which way up it was. So you can see, because we put no size on the image, it's all coming off, and we quite like this sort of very gentle circular movement. We use a lovely soft brush because we don't want to scratch our gold leaf. We've done all this hard work to keep it shiny, and if we scratched it with a stiff brush, that would take away some of the shine. So with real gold leaf, we will be saving all these little bits. Now, if you get big bits like that that are left over, I think they're worth saving. So just grab a bit of that other paper. Any big bits can go in there and be saved. And real gold leaf is even more fragile than this. It's slightly thicker than real 24 karat gold leaf. So it's no bad thing to get used to handling it before going on to the expensive stuff, if that's what you fancy doing. Now, if, say, like here, you've got gold leaf sticking where you don't want it, you can use the end of scissors just to scratch it away. And I hope you can see that's what I was trying to do, was to get a sort of softish edge around his lovely tail, and maybe around, give him a bit of a furry bum, so that he's got a smooth edge to his legs, but say slightly jagged edges elsewhere. When you're happy with your gold leaf, we want to think about its whiskers. I love whiskers. I've got a pen, and I'm going to see whether it will go on top of the see whether this ink will go on top sufficiently of the gold leaf. Not brilliant. A bit slower, that might be okay. So watercolour will not go on top of gold leaf, but usually pen will. The alternative might be to use an acrylic marker if you've got one. You could use a very fine rigger with some Indian ink and paint them on. Remember that whiskers will cross, they won't all go in the same direction, there'll be different lengths, so try and get them as sort of natural as possible. Another thing I quite like to do, because what I want to do is integrate the gold and the image, and that can be a tricky thing to do. What I can do is actually grab a bit of my Indian ink, protect my image, and then just as I've got the raised gold splatters, I could just do a couple of little taps of black. I don't usually do this, but I've got actually a blue pen, and I might just put a tiny bit of colour into these whiskers. I'm just finding them a bit solid. And here is our finished hare. It's dried overnight so that those little spatters of ink are all dry. I was very worried that I would end up just smudging them, so those have all dried. I could fiddle around a little more with its whiskers, but I don't think that would significantly add to it. The last thing I need to do is, of course, varnish it, because artificial gold leaf has got lots of copper in it and it will tarnish with time. I like to use a UV varnish. It needs to be gloss and it needs to be a spray, because a brush potentially will pick up the watercolour and smear it. I'll spray it all over with that varnish, and then I have got a brush on matte clear varnish, and I will just go over the hair so that the hair will remain matte and the background will remain shiny. I'm going to sign this on the back rather than on the front, simply because it's very difficult to sign your signature on top of gold leaf. You know, that's a personal preference. So I hope you really enjoyed seeing how we can work on canvas in a different way from paper. If you want to find out more about working in watercolour on canvas and a lot more details, do look at www.lizchadertonstudio.co.uk, where I've got a full course all about watercolours on canvas.